My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Just a few hours remain in the race to vote for the next Prime Minister and indeed Conservative Party leader. We'll see just how sure this election is. Is it all Liz Truss's? Is it all sewn up? Well, the voting closes at lunchtime today. Also today, we explore attitudes towards violent crime. Exclusive GB News polling has found that majority of people in this country find that it's out of control. What can be done about crime? About authoritarian attitude amongst the population of the UK, and we speak to the UK's new space champion. All after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. President Biden has warned Republican extremism is a threat to American democracy. The Democrat said Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again agenda, also known as MAGA, was determined to take the country backwards. Top Republican Kevin McCarthy hit back, saying Mr. Biden should apologize for slandering tens of millions of Americans as fascists. The president delivered his speech from Philadelphia, the birthplace of American democracy, and accused some Republicans of inciting political violence. Narrowly avoided being killed after a man pointed a gun at her head and pulled the trigger. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was threatened outside her home in Buenos Aires yesterday. No shots were fired and she was unharmed. The country's president has confirmed the gun was loaded with 5 bullets, but failed to fire when triggered. Police said the gunman, identified by local media as a 35-year-old Brazilian man, has been taken into custody. Voting in the Tory leadership contest closes at 5 p.m. today, with the results set to be announced on Monday. Either Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak will take over from Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after a contest dominated by the cost of living crisis. And Bristol Zoo is being shut down due to financial problems caused by the pandemic. The site, which has been open for 186 years, will finally close its doors tomorrow. All of the animals will be moved to a bigger location in South Gloucester called the Wild Place Project. The existing site will be developed into eco-friendly housing. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
Hello and welcome to the briefing with me, Tom Harwood. The time is 9:30 and I'm on your television and your radio. Well, let's kick off today with something slightly different. Earlier this week, technical problems scuppered NASA's launch of the first rocket in its Artemis project, a rocket that will once again aspire to put the feet of men and women on the surface of the moon. NASA will reattempt the launch of Artemis 1 in just a few days' time, but it's certain we'll see more funding, investment and innovation aimed towards the sky. But space exploration isn't just the pastime of our transatlantic neighbours. Here in the UK, there are some very exciting projects brewing too. And I'm delighted to be joined first this morning by David Morris MP, the UK's first national space champion. And just first of all, David Morris, you have in the last month or so been appointed to this role. What does it encompass?
Hi, Tom. This role is basically I'm a trade envoy to the space industry and linking up. My main primary task is to link up the small and medium-sized enterprises, and there's a plethora of them all across the UK, linking them in with government awareness. So my job really is to bring to the table shall we say, the smaller operators that actually feed into the larger operators like your Lockheeds, your Boeings, your BAE Systems, your NASA. Bring them all around the table and see how we can maximise their output and their creativity, and more to the point, the technological advancements that we're very good at doing.
It's a fascinating industry. Most people will be aware of Cape Canaveral in Florida. Most people will have seen footage of those enormous rockets that NASA launches down there in Florida. But most people probably aren't aware that we've actually been launching some smaller rockets here at home.
Well, we are hoping to be launching there are two sorts of spaceports that we're developing at the moment. One is horizontal takeoff, meaning space tourism, putting into orbit satellites under the wings of commercial airliners, like firing a rocket into space. And the other one is ballistics, where you can push a rocket further on out into orbit. One's going to be in St. Ives. We've got a launch hopefully next month. It will be the first launch that we're going to be doing from underneath the wing of an aircraft. And we're looking to be launching in Saxfjord, which is a spaceport at the top end of Scotland in the Shetlands. But it is a fact we have been launching with Ariane and with ESA for very many years at Kourou. We have a spaceport in Kourou, which I wouldn't say rivals NASA, it complements NASA. There are a lot of launch sites there, and we've even had Soyuz operating from there. I'm very sad to say that because of the bad politics we have between ourselves and Russia at this moment in time, that has had to stop. But the working relationship that we did have with Soyuz was very good.
It is remarkable that for almost a decade, the only way that anyone could get into low Earth orbit was on a Russian rocket. When the US retired its space shuttle, the American astronauts, the European astronauts, the British astronauts, and indeed the Russian astronauts all went up on that Soyuz craft, that spacecraft that is really quite old tech, but I suppose at the very least sturdy. Now, with all of these new entrants into the market, the likes of SpaceX, the likes of Blue Origin, the Jeff Bezos company, the likes indeed of Virgin Galactic, owned by Richard Branson, are we starting to see a way in which potentially nefarious partners in this industry can be set to one side and we can actually work with reasonable entrepreneurs rather than pretty dodgy states?
Yes, for a long time now, especially in America, it's been going down the line of let's use private enterprise to see how we can make space cheaper and more accessible. And we've been doing it in the UK as well. We've been partnered up with ESA for very many years, for nearly 4 decades now. And, we did make our own rockets and we did send them up from Australia back in the 1950s. So, we have the technology to do these wondrous tasks that we're going to be looking at in the near future. And mining on the moon is now starting to become a feasible reality. We're starting to look at how we can actually put together a team and a way of mining on the moon. And the Artemis project, what UK are doing with ESA is making large components for an orbiting space station around the moon, where the astronauts would go to before they go down to the moon. So you can see we're starting to look towards a future, and it's the near future that is attainable. It's not in the far distant future. Private enterprise always finds a way. I've always said that. Business will always find a way, and business has found a way. And I think, I won't say we're playing catch up to America. We're not, because we actually interface with them on a technological scale and have done for very, very many years. But what we're now starting to do is utilise space, because it is now becoming a utility. This interview that we're conducting now, I'm absolutely certain is going up into space and going back down to your audience on the TV. Our iPhone, our satellite navigation systems, even when we switch on our Hive systems or those sorts of systems in our homes to regulate our gas usage and our electricity usage. That's all powered by satellites as well. So you can see that space is not just about the sexy stuff of putting man on the moon and, orbiting space stations, advancement of mankind to the stars. It's more homegrown products at this moment in time that's making the money that is actually feeding back into our economy. If you can imagine, at this moment in time, the UK is getting in the region of about 16 billion into its economy. Just from space applications, and years ago it was a lot less than that, and the space industry has been bucking the trends against every recession going. It is an area where if we invest £1 in from government, we get £12 back. So it is punching above its weight, and we're punching above our weight as a scientific nation doing this kind of work.
It's a really fascinating area, David Morris, and I suppose one of the biggest exciting things in this area is that we now have our first national space champion. I wonder if in future years, instead of seeing kids walking around towns and cities in this country wearing T-shirts with the word NASA on them, perhaps we'll see T-shirts with the words UKSA, the UK Space Agency. Perhaps that might be a bit of a bigger part of our lives in the future. I suppose we'll have to wait and see. But for now, David Morris, really appreciate your time here on The Briefing and this very exciting sector that's growing in the UK. Well, now to our main story of the day. The day is finally here. Yes, Friday the 2nd of September is the final day of the Tory leadership contest, and we're in the final hours of voting. After a long summer of hustings and headlines, at 5 p.m. this afternoon, the ballots will close and the count will begin to establish who the Tory membership have put their faith in to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Well, I'm joined now by the head of political polling at Opinium, Chris Curtis. And Chris, I suppose the first question here has got to be, is this pretty dead set on? This must be a very difficult group of people to poll. Most of the polls are saying precisely the same thing, that this is Liz Truss's for the losing, that she's got an enormous lead. But how can that be the case when we don't even know how many Tory party members there are?
Morning, Tom. Right, so I mean, look, nothing in the universe is ever 100%, right? Like, we always do have to build in some level of uncertainty. The bookies put it at roughly a 5% chance that Rishi Sunak's going to win. That feels roughly right to me. So, 1 in every 20 universes we'll see Liz Truss not winning this contest. And the reason that we're so confident that Liz Truss is going to go on to win is because all of the opinion polls so far, from lots of different pollsters using lots of different approaches, have all shown, a comfortable lead for Liz Truss. Our final opinion poll of the race put it at 61% Liz Truss, 39% Rishi Sunak. Now, there are reasons to believe that opinion polling of Conservative Party members is a lot more difficult. We don't know how many there are. Like you just said, we don't know sort of their demographic profile, unlike the population as a whole. A lot of them are very old and therefore less likely to be taking part in online opinion polls. But despite all of those facts, the fact that in all of the polls we've got, the gap is so large, still means that we're fairly confident that Liz Truss is going to go on to win.
And assuming that does happen, looking at all of the myriad issues that the country faces, it's going to be a very tough first week next week. Assuming Liz Truss wins, she'll be through the door of Downing Street probably quite late on Tuesday. and immediately will have to appoint a cabinet and start tackling some of these big issues. Would you expect that a new Prime Minister would get a bit of a honeymoon period, potentially a bounce in the polls?
Yeah, so it's worth noting that this sort of transition for Liz Truss is going to be very different to what Boris Johnson went through in 2019, because Boris Johnson spent the whole of the 2019 Conservative leadership election appealing to Conservative Party members by pointing out that he was the best man to get Brexit done. Then, a few months later, he went to the country and he convinced them that he was the best man to be Prime Minister by saying that he was the best man to get Brexit done. There wasn't a big pivot where you're saying one thing to the Conservative Party members and then saying a completely different thing to the public as a whole. This is going to be different for Liz Truss, because actually, I mean, if you go back and listen to a lot of those hustings speech, there's very little talk, if any talk at all, from her about the NHS. That's the second most important issue to voters out there in the country. We still don't have a fleshed out plan for what she's going to do to tackle the cost of living crisis, to keep people's energy bills down this winter. So ultimately, she is going to have to do a massive pivot over the coming weeks where she starts talking to voters out there in the country, their problems, their hopes, their dreams, rather than just Conservative Party members. Her ability, I think, her ability to do that is ultimately going to decide whether she ends up getting that honeymoon period. I expect we will see a big pivot. I expect we will see a big fiscal intervention, and that's why I think she'll end up doing all right in the polls. I think the problem for her in the long run is probably going to be that she's made lots of promises during this Tory leadership election, many of which are incredibly expensive, and will she be able to keep all of those promises alongside fixing the cost of living crisis and helping get rid of backlogs in the NHS?
As the world travels towards recession, as the United Kingdom travels towards maybe even 20% inflation, it really is a sort of potentially not the best chalice to be handed, perhaps a slightly poisoned one at this point in time. I suppose that Liz Truss will be wanting to not go for a snap election. What do the polls say in terms of whether the country at large would like there to be something like that?
I'm speaking from memory here, but I'm pretty sure we've had a couple of polls asking that specific question. I think generally, actually, more people say that they do want a general election than don't. Obviously, don't mention that to Brenda in Bristol, but that's driven by the fact that this new Prime Minister doesn't necessarily have a mandate, so should somebody deserve and be allowed to be Prime Minister when they've been voted in by 160,000 Conservative members rather than the country as a whole? If you ask voters out there, they don't think that that's fair, and many of them therefore support an election.
Well, just finally in our conversation, Chris Curtis, GBNews has carried out has commissioned, I should say, an exclusive poll over the last few days that shows that the majority of Brits believe that violent crime in this country is out of control. When we're looking at the crime statistics and the really horrific situations that we've seen in Liverpool, in Manchester, in London, and the violent crime that has accompanied those, is this going to be a larger issue that sort of goes up the order of ranking in terms of what people are concerned about and what politicians, frankly, focus on?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we haven't been talking very much about crime recently, it hasn't sort of been making the news quite as much as it probably should be, and that's because it's been drowned out by other problems, the NHS and the cost of living crisis. But it is still there. Opinion polls still show that people are really concerned about crime. It comes up in focus groups all the time when you ask people about what the biggest problem is in their local community. And this is really ultimately just feeds into the conversation we were having about Liz Truss and how it's going to be when she takes over. It's not just the size of the problems that she has to fix. It's the number of problems that she has to fix. It's the cost of living crisis. It's the NHS. It is ultimately these big crime rates. It is the potential for a recession on the horizon. It is just problem after problem after problem, and she's going to have a massive job on her hands in order to try and sort of solve all of them at the same time.
Well, what a sunny way to end this conversation. Chris Curtis, appreciate your time here on The Briefing this morning and that really rosy outlook for the next few months and years. Well, let's keep on the subject of this poll now. The majority of Brits believing that violent crime across the country is out of control. Let's dive into the findings. 61% think that criminals are using more and more physical force against their victims. Let's discuss this more now with Donna Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire. Donna, this is really concerning data that we're seeing now. Not even the slight majority, but a vast majority of Brits feeling, frankly, unsafe.
Yeah, Tom, it is a concern. And unfortunately, this is very much going in the wrong direction for British policing. There have been a number of events that have happened over the last 2 years, which have culminated in then sentencing trials, etc., including Sarah Everard with Wayne Couzens, over the last 12 months that have really, really led to this this groundswell of public sort of concern and lack of confidence. Now, I think that policing is almost coming to a bit of a watershed moment. I hate to coin the phrase back to basics. It's a Tony Blair well-used political slogan, but it works very well here in policing. Policing have tried to be perhaps everything to everyone, and I don't want to knock them. I think they've got an incredibly hard job on their hands. One of the reasons we all know that they're in the position they're now in, struggling to get to all those burglaries, struggling to prioritise the crimes that we want them to as taxpayers, is because they've had the number of police officers cut over the last 12 years. So let's get the white elephant in the room out on the table straight away. Now, that is being repaired. We know that Boris Johnson made that fantastic pledge going into the 2019 general, the 20,000 police uplift. My own force, we're going to overshoot our target. In Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, our target was 498 officers. I pledged 600, 102 more, because I wanted to go above and beyond for the taxpayers that I serve, and I have found the money to do that. But actually, more police will mean safer streets and safer communities. At the moment, we all know it needs tweaking. Chief constables have been trying to respond to LGBT communities that don't feel that the police really represent them because of times gone by and stigmas towards, gay people in the past. So they've been going to pride events, but they've not been going to burglaries. This is a time to get back to basics. And as I say, a watershed moment for British policing, I think, in 2022.
I wonder how much of British police time is frankly taken up by some of the form filling that has to go on. Politicians over the last couple of decades have boasted about keeping frontline police officers there out on the streets, but reducing backroom functionings. To what extent has that actually meant that those frontline policing, those individuals who are supposed to be on the streets, end up filling out the forms anyway because there aren't the backroom people there who should be doing that sort of administration? Have we shot ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point. And just for the public who don't understand, you have police officers and then you have police staff. So the police staff will be people obviously not warranted, police officers. They are often the admin support people behind the scenes, as Tom's just said there. And actually, Tom, that's a good point that you're making. There is so much bureaucracy. And because we live in a country where we have one of the most sophisticated legal systems in the country, what that does mean is that our culture to sue when something goes wrong is sophisticated, and people can get access to fairly cheap legal aid, legal support to do that. Now, as a consequence, the public services in this country have built in risk at every single juncture, which means that form filling is off the scale, and policing is not immune from that. So police officers, when they arrest somebody, they have to do a welfare check, they have to fill in a welfare form. It's called a PPM1 form. That may go off to the MASH, the Multi-Agency Services Hub. That could be to children's services, adult social care, a referral to a charity if someone was suicidal and about to jump in front of a train. They have to do that. If they don't do that, and that person then subsequently threw themselves in front of a train, 3-4 days later, that could come back on that officer or the crew for not doing what they needed to do in terms of safeguarding. Then you've got the forms they have to fill in when they book them into custody. Then they've got their arresting officer statement they need to fill in. There is so much bureaucracy. And actually, as a police and crime committee,
it's a really, really tricky situation there. Perhaps that's something that the next Prime Minister should look at. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation, Donna Jones, but really appreciate your time. We'll have to get you back very, very soon. Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Well, finally this morning, the think tank Onward has published new and alarming research on the rising authoritarianism among young people, links to loneliness and social media. The report found that young people are 3 times more likely to reject democracy than their grandparents. I'm joined now by Luke Stanley, senior researcher at Onward and author of this report. And should we be shocked, should we be surprised that young people especially do not see such value in democratic institutions compared to their grandparents?
Good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me on. Yes, I think we should be quite alarmed with the statistics, as you say, that show that people are 3 times less likely than their grandparents to support democracy. But it's not just that; they're also more likely to say that authoritarian forms of government, like having a strong leader who doesn't have to deal with parliament, or having the army run the country, is a better form of government. But what's interesting, I mean, we've done research on this in the past. We did a poll back in 2019 that showed that this phenomenon was happening. But what's really interesting is, as you say, that it's sort of linked to loneliness. So there's 2 main drivers we found so far that link to this. So there's this sort of narrow social networks, people caring more about their sort of political values, their sense of self, and having fewer friends that have different views than they have. So it's sort of an echo chamber there. And also this sort of always online culture, where we found that 1/3 of young people have more friends online than they do in real life. And apart from that as well, there's something like 1 in 10 of them spend more than 7 hours a day on social media. So it's that kind of thing as well, which is driving this phenomenon.
In our final 60 seconds, I wonder to what extent the problems, particularly within Britain, within our political culture over the last half-decade, have bubbled up here. The idea that mainstream politicians have been saying it's a correct idea to rerun referendums, whether it's on Brexit or whether it's on Scottish independence, might that have filtered into young people's understanding of whether or not democracy is the right course of action?
Well, perhaps. I mean, our research doesn't really show that. What it shows is there's this sort of long-term trend over the last 20 years that's being driven, as I say, by loneliness. But I'm sure there's other factors as well.
Really, really interesting stuff there. Well, Luke Stanley, senior researcher at Onward, really appreciate your time this morning. Fascinating report from your organisation. Encourage everyone to have a look at it. Well, that's it for me today on The Briefing. Coming up, it's To The Point with Anaya Flaren Iman. But first, here's the weather.
Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update. Good morning to you. The weather is on the change. I think we'll all see some wet weather over the weekend. Today, the showers a bit more scattered, so many places won't see them and stay dry with some sunny spells. But the UK is surrounded. Weather fronts approaching from the south and from the northwest, and they're going to kind of merge together to bring some pretty wet conditions in places over the next couple of days. Today, as I said, it's scattered showers, so you may miss them. Parts of the Midlands seeing a few this morning and seeing wetter across western Scotland through the day. A bit of a chilly start this morning across Scotland, but temperatures rising with the help of some decent spells of sunshine. Largely fine over northern England too, and we'll see some hazy sunshine across the south. But here I think we'll see a few more of those showers breaking out by this afternoon. Possibility of a thunderstorm here and there, but quite warm and humid in the southeast, 26, maybe 27. Generally, temperatures getting into the low 20s for most. The wet weather in the northwest, that's going to really pep up this evening for parts of Northern Ireland and western Scotland. Once it's set in, it's going to last into the weekend. Elsewhere, a scattering of heavy showers for England and Wales this evening, but they tend to fade away, so generally a dry night, but later on we'll see some rain coming into Wales and northwest England. Again, quite warm and humid across the south, and a warmer night, certainly than last night across Scotland and Northern Ireland, but a wetter night as well. And this rain, as I said, once it's set in, could last for most of Saturday. So we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place covering a good part of Northern Ireland and parts of southwest Scotland. Rain building up through the day and, of course, overnight. Elsewhere, there'll be showers scattered across England and Wales once more, but some heavier ones likely, particularly over parts of the east. Still hit and miss, so no guarantee that you're going to see rain in areas that could really do with it, of course. And still some sunny spells between the showers, but more showers likely on Sunday as well. Still that heavy rain in places. Quite a warm and humid feel, though, throughout this weekend. Bye for now.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.